Hello, welcome to Eggonomics, a presentation about, no, not really eggs. It's really about understanding capitalism and socialism and how they relate to each other. You'll see why I'm talking about eggs later. So just to set the background here, this debate about capitalism versus socialism has been going on for decades. And it's full of some very entrenched positions, and in my opinion, it generates a lot more heat than light. So what I want to do here is actually attempt to analyze the real life relationship between capitalism and socialism through the medium of eggs, obviously. What I'll do first is I'll just discuss what I mean by socialism and capitalism in this context. Then I'll go on to analyze the grey areas between them, and then try and take an overview of where we are now and how these things should be interacting. Now, what do we mean by socialism? I'm going to claim here that in fact socialism has been the historic norm in one way or the other. So think about this. Think about most generations of humans were hunter-gatherers. They lived in relatively small groups and they did everything together. They shared, they hunted, they ran away, they wandered together, they built fires together, etc. It was a communal existence that I would describe as, by our understanding of, as a socialist way of life, even though they wouldn't have thought of it that way themselves. And they did this for support and protection. It's the basic behavior of humans. They gather in groups because we're really quite vulnerable by ourselves out in the wilds. The next thing I would say that happened would be people started to live in larger groups, bigger than the hunter-gatherer group, and they would tend to have more fixed territory. They would stop wandering and actually settle down somewhere. Probably wants to develop some form of agriculture. Like, they would form villages, and that would probably require some sort of central control to provide order. And there would be social obligations, maybe a bit more independence, but it would still be a very sharing and communal existence. Then there's what you might call feudal socialism, where nations have been created, and now you've got your lord in his castle and the peasants in the field, and the peasants' lives are largely controlled. They're told what to farm, and they're told how much they have to pay to the lord, how much they have to pay to the church. There's a king in charge somewhere. So you developed a centralized authority, but it's authoritarian, it's hierarchical, it's still, I would say, socialist. And finally, I think what we might call political socialism, where they're working to even larger groups and you have centralized political authorities. I think this is not all that different from feudalism, to be honest. But we all know this is kind of the Russian, the Soviet Union, China, etc., where the politically socialist countries have taken shape. So this discussion of socialism then leads us naturally back to eggs. Okay, this must seem a bit strange, but what I'm going to do is take some of the concepts from this previous discussion and start building an egg. And the first thing I'm going to take is defense. This is a intrinsically socialist activity. It is paid by central taxation, it is centralized command and control, it is authoritarian. And it's the part of the egg that faces the outside, because it defends the egg, or the society as you might otherwise look at it. And the next step I'm going to look at is order. That the idea of having a chief, somebody who makes the rules, somebody who settles disputes, law and order. And that's on the inside, because it faces into the society that it manages. These are fundamentally governance issues, and they're very, by nature, very socialist, and they make the outside of the egg. You see where I'm going with this now? So let's move on to capitalism, something that we very much associate with the Western world. So I'd like to start with a bit of food for thought. Presumably you recognize this guy in the picture here. If you don't, just turn the video off. But this guy, Winston Churchill, he was born 1874 and he died in 1965. Is that interesting? Well, what's interesting is that in 1874, the Royal Navy was overwhelmingly still sailing wooden ships with muzzle-loading cannon. Okay, they were experimenting with some ironclads and breech loading things, but most of the navy was wooden ships, pretty much how it had been in the Napoleonic Wars. Skip forward to 1914 and we're looking at dreadnoughts, massive steel battleships. It's the most incredible level of change. But it's nothing compared to what happened in 1945. Then we just started wiping out cities. And Winston Churchill is 70 by then. In fact, he lived on to see all sorts of interesting things and only just missed out on this by a couple of years. Let's be clear, this was the effect of capitalism in society. And capitalism is just the reinvestment of spare resources into production. To be clear, I'm not talking about finance. Finance is just our current implementation of this, which is quite problematic in many ways, but it's not capitalism itself. So don't confuse the two. To give context, let's look at other outbreaks of capitalism. Start with ancient Greece. Now, they invented all sorts of interesting things like lighthouses and democracy and cement. Then you've got Rome, it's aqueducts, concrete, glass blowing, etc. Chinese Empire, gunpowder, kites, paper money, Islamic crescent, algebra, steel mills, flywheels. These civilizations were all way, way richer than the people around them. And people used to fight to get into the Roman Empire. And the reason is that they had a level of capitalism going on inside them, and so they just became much richer than everybody else around them. And they developed far faster and far further, even if it was still slow by our standards. By contrast, with parts of the world that didn't have capitalism, in 2000 BC, the Hittites invented a two-wheel chariot, and 500 years later, the Egyptians invented a better chariot. Another 500 years go by and somebody develops cavalry. Great. 1,000 years after that, Julius Caesar turns up in Britain with his concrete and aqueducts and finds the British are using chariots. While over in South America, they've not even invented the wheel. You must really never underestimate this ability of a society to just not progress when it's under an authoritarian control system. You just end up using llamas for transport. What Greece and Rome and China and particularly the Western world had, all these advancing cultures had some degree of citizens' rights. More specifically, they had the rule of law and the right to retain your property. Now, all these earlier civilizations still had large slave populations and emperors and authoritarian systems, so they didn't progress at the rate that Western democracy did. But Western democracy has, because it's the most advanced democracy, it has had the most effective capitalism, hence the incredible rate of progress. I mean, who would actually invest their capital if they didn't have the right to keep the returns? Would you invent something if you're a slave? So let's go back to my egg. I'm going to claim that if socialism creates the hard shell of society, and capitalism is the golden yolk that generates progress. Capitalism cannot exist without some sort of shell to protect it, obviously the military and law and order. But socialism itself doesn't generate wealth or progress. But capitalism will only work if it's bound to that shell by chains of democracy, which I'm modeling here as the chalets of an egg. These are actually membranes found inside an egg that keep the yolk attached correctly in the middle of the egg so it's not smashed to pieces on the hard shell if the egg moves. So this is the start of my analysis by egg. Never has there been such a level of economic development or progress as in the last 250 years in the West. Any other countries that are complaining about having been exploited by empires have all themselves been parts of empires and conquered their neighbours in the past. What they haven't done is developed a proper democratic system that allows them to develop proper capitalism. So I'd like to now go, taking my analogy a little bit further and look at education and welfare and flesh things out a bit. Welfare obviously has always existed right back from hunter-gatherer societies where more vulnerable members of society would share in whatever the society produced. But as numbers of people increase, there's going to be some sort of authority organising this. Now, this might be a very local sort of welfare system, or it might be entirely charitably based, but all societies seem to have had something. Now, it's never really going to be a capitalist or free market thing, welfare. It's always a very socialist thing. Moving on to education. Now, education is a bit of a funny one because there's not really a historical equivalent of it. Modern education systems are quite new, really. But all I can say is that in developed countries, there is always public education for secondary primary school pupils. They all know they have to educate their population. Third world countries are often in a position where parents can't send their children to school, so their children are kind of doomed, especially in this world. But again, education, particularly for children, really has turned out to be, by observation, an entirely socialist type activity. So back to my egg. Let's add in a couple more layers here. We've got welfare and education. Again, they're near the socialist outside of the egg, and the golden yolk is in the middle. But here's a grey area. Here's when you get closer to the yolk, but you're further away from the socialist edge. This is where it gets a bit less clear what is what. I'd like to look into this now a little bit. To do this, we're quite lucky in a sense, in that the last 40 years in the UK, there's been a lot of privatizations going on. Industries being moved from the public sector to the private sector, largely by the Conservative Party. So I'm going to take a quick look at water, electricity, rail, and telecoms, and analyse how these privatizations work. So let's start with water. And before I go any further, just to let you know that the information I'm going to give you is mostly taken from this report here, the privatised water industry in the UK, an ATM for investors. Now you might assume from the title it's not a particularly friendly report to the water industry, but I have not seen anybody actually deny its findings. So, 1990, about 21 companies were created, water companies, some water and sewage companies. But there's a big variety of them across the country. In 2024, these companies discharged sewage into our rivers and lakes and streams 450,000 times for 3.6 million hours. And since 1990, despite our increasing population, they've managed to build absolutely no new reservoirs. Now, back in 1990, these companies, they invested about 3.8 billion in equity into these water companies, which were creaking, to be fair, at the time. Since then, they have withdrawn £83 billion in dividends over 35 years at 2025 values. Now, the 3.8 billion is worth about 9 billion today, to be fair. But nevertheless, if you're going to do some simple calculations here, they'll be making about a 25% return every year on their investment. I mean, that is a huge return in exchange for shit in your rivers and no new reservoirs, no new infrastructure. There are also £70 billion in debt. So not only have they borrowed lots of money to run their companies, they've not even managed to produce any infrastructure for it. In fact, these companies spend 35% of their total revenue on dividends and interest on their loans. In any market, that sounds pretty bad. But of course, this is quite a kind of unique sort of market. And people might argue, well, even under these circumstances, it would be worse if it was in the public sector. What can you really compare it to? It's difficult to kind of prove that this can't be any better. Oh, except that there is somewhere. It's called Scottish Water. The Scottish Water is effectively a public corporation. So let's make some comparisons. Bills in Scotland are on average about £490 versus £603 in England and Wales. So that's about 20% less, slightly more than 20% less in Scotland on water bills. Despite this, Scottish Water invests £180 per head compared to £120 per head in England and Wales. So actual infrastructure investment is way higher, 50% higher than England and Wales. And they spend 8% of their revenue on finance costs. That's like, well, they don't pay dividends. So their interest payments are 8% of their revenues. That's 35% in England and Wales. So you might say it's just slightly outperforming the privatized water companies. And why is this? Why are the privatized water companies such a disaster, as they obviously are to any rational person? Well, it's really simple. The main reason is because the private sector was handed a totally captive market. You have to have water, and there's only one group of people to buy it off. And you've also got, of course, a regulator who's in the position of trying to make these privatizations look successful. So overall, I would have to consider this privatization to be a complete and total fucking disaster, as it was obvious to anybody it was going to be. So moving on to electricity. The electricity market is a kind of a strange thing. It starts with the generators, obviously, and then there's the customers at the other end of the market. In between, we have these things called the sellers, which is a kind of thing created by the government. And connecting the actual generators and customers is the transmission network. Now, obviously, what the transmission network does is it moves the power from the generators to the consumers. And the sellers seem to sort of manage the administrative side of that. So the generators, there's about 58 suppliers of electricity in the UK across actually quite a large number of generation sites, over 1,000. Well, a lot of those are very small hydro type things. So a relatively small number of large power stations. This covers gas, nuclear, wind, biomass, solar, and hydro, of course. Now, this has lots of room for innovation, this market, lots of engineering, better turbines, more efficient solar panels, better connectors, all sorts of things the engineers can do to generate electricity more cost effectively and more efficiently. Then there's a transmission network, which in England and Wales is the national grid. Scotland has two companies doing it, and there's one more in Northern Ireland. But all of these, each of them control large discrete areas. They're not managing intermixed networks. The electricity networks require centralized control. You can't just have people putting in cables willy-nilly. You may not know this, but the laws of quantum physics say if you plug in a radio in John O'Groats, then a toaster in Land's End knows about it. Okay, everything affects everything else in an electricity grid, so it's got to be centrally managed by skilled engineers. And obviously it's heavily state-controlled, state-directed, and in fact in England and Wales that's become more and more so as time has gone on. Then there's the sellers. Now the sellers kind of contract with customers to supply energy to them, and then they go and buy the energy off the generators. We have about 84 suppliers originally, I think, in this market. We're down to 24 as they keep collapsing and customers are passed over to other sellers. It's quite unclear what this market really adds, to be perfectly honest. And customers, of course, are supposed to choose their seller, and the seller's supposed to put pressure on the generators to bring prices down, etc. But I can't really see that this works. It doesn't make any sense, and that's why it's collapsing in and on itself. So all we're choosing is just who bills us, essentially. And the only innovation that I can see, given that they all supply the same product, which is 240 volts, every supplier is exactly the same. So it's just a price difference. So the only innovation is just how confusing they can make their bills. In reality, going through these bills, understanding what your static costs are, your standing charges, and what your evening costs and what your daily costs are, and what changes the government's going to make in the future. Knowing this would be a full-time job. And given you're probably going to save about 50 quid in a year, it really isn't worth most people while really paying much attention to this. Most people might change a supplier every few years on a whim, but don't think very many people really go through the analysis of what's going to save them any money. So overall, I'm just going to say that the electricity privatization has been meh, meh. It's all right. It's not a disaster. It's a bit kind of irrational. I don't think it's added anything, but it's not shit the way that the water privatization was. So it gets a score of meh. On to the railways. So they were privatized in the 1990s. And there was structured as a rail track, which was a business, and the train operating companies running separately. Now, Railtrack managed a network, but it turned out that they were very good at pumping up their share price and not particularly good at maintaining the network. So it went bankrupt and it was replaced by Network Rail, which is the situation we now have. Of those train operators, only as one has actually collapsed, although some have lost their franchises in the meantime. So, if we go on and we decide to have a look at all the pros and cons, how it's worked out. So actually, pre-booked and season fares are actually cheaper than they used to be after inflation, although standard fares are actually twice as expensive. So it's a mixed picture. We're actually running more trains, especially compared to the EU, but their punctuality is worse. We've got twice as many passengers in terms of distance and numbers, and in fact this has increased twice compared to the comparable EU rail systems. But subsidies have increased in the meantime. Rolling stock is newer, but most of the investment coming to the system is actually government funded in reality. Safety has improved, surprisingly, and now there were multiple crashes in the early years under Railtrack, but since 2002 the British railway system is the safest in Europe. In fact, statistically 150 people are still alive than would not otherwise have been. Against this, the government's actually covering a larger percentage of the cost for the rail system than it did under British Rail. But the profitability of the system is for about 3.4%, which is not excessive. It's kind of stock market average. So it's not being a way of pumping money out of the public. And one thing that is sad though is that R&D has disappeared. British Rail actually had world-class R&D, but that's almost completely finished since privatization. And the ownership and profits of the company are actually now mostly foreign transport systems, which seems a little strange. So what that gives us is, for the network infrastructure is now a Quango-like sort of private company. It's really a public corporation, really. But it's tightly state controlled and it's mostly state funded. The investment in the railways really now is coming from the state. The train operators, on the other hand, well, they have to attract customers, so they have to provide a service. And the customers do have choices. They can take the car or the bus or cycle or something, or even fly. So in fact, what we've got now is a kind of a mixed system here. And if you look at the pros and cons, it's done okay. It's not like, sing the praises to the heavens, but it's okay. The privatization is modeled through to produce something which works reasonably adequately. So finally, telecoms. In 1979, the Conservatives created British Telecom, and in 1982, they sold shares to the public, and in theory, they allowed new entrants into the telecoms market. By 2001, it was 30 billion in debt, and the telecoms market was still quite limited. And it looked like the whole telecoms privatization was going to be pretty meh, along with the electricity market. And then the internet arrived. And now we've got a whole range of people who will give us a connection to the internet, and channel media into our homes. And we've got a huge selection of people who provide media on those digital interfaces. These people are competing for our money, they're competing with new programs, faster telecom speeds, all sorts of things are being offered. This is a fantastic example of how a free market should work. Now, it might well have been more luck than judgment, but I've got to say I consider the telecoms privatization to turn out to be a great success. So we really have a range of outcomes for our privatization, ranging from the pile of doo-doo at the bottom, which is water, then energy, which is kind of crap, but not too bad, rail, which is okay, and telecoms, which is the prize winner. So let's look at what controls, what succeeds in the private sector and what doesn't. First up, consumer choice. Water, you have no choice. You've got to have water and you've got no choice as a supplier. Electricity, well, you've got a kind of fake choice, really. You've got these sellers in between, but it doesn't really make any difference. You get the same product of all of them. You're just trying to understand your bills. Rail, well, you do have some choice. I mean, normally you go with the train that goes where you want, when you want, but you could go by car or bus or plane instead. So there is a degree of choice. And telecoms, well, actually, you've got a great choice. You probably need the internet, but you've got lots of suppliers and lots of things you can buy on the internet. So those are choices there. You must remember that information and processing information takes time. So you like water bills, well, you've got no choice of your supplier, so your water bills are straightforward. But your power bills, they're absolutely Byzantine. I mean, to understand all about your standing charges, your evening uses and your peak uses, and all the changes on plans and controls from Ofgem, it would take a lot of effort to actually understand all this. And what would you save? Maybe 50 quid. Is it actually worth the time that you put in? I mean, I don't really want to be a confused foot soldier in somebody else's commercial battle because I just have no skin in this game, quite frankly. The money I would save is not worth the time I would put in. So if you want to make a commercial market work, the people have to have skin in the game in the sense they have to be able to save some money or get more benefit by spending their time processing information about the market. Now, a good example of this would actually be retail banking. So people very rarely switch bank accounts. So the government is trying to promote this. They want more competition in the market. So they created the current account switch service in 2013. Nevertheless, last year, only 2% of account holders switched banks. And these were mostly young people. And if you look at the adverts that are out there, you paid £175 to £200 to switch your account. The reality is, if you want people to switch accounts, you actually have to pay them to do it. And only those for whom that money is worth a lot will take the trouble to do it. People are just not interested in operating this market. They don't feel they have skin in the game. They just want their bank to work. Next up is complexity. Both the power systems and rail networks are complex networks, and therefore they've both ended up under centralized control. Both of these are networks where a change somewhere in the network has a significant effect elsewhere in the network. Okay, now compare this to the likes of fiber optics, where it's also a very sophisticated technology, but it multiplexes. That means that two data packets can actually pass through each other without interfering. Unlike, say, for instance, a rail network where trains can't pass through each other. So, for instance, the same would be true of roads. Roads, two lorries on the road can actually operate completely independently of each other, more or less ignoring what the other does, unless, of course, there's a huge major crash or something. And I call this the integrated versus discrete problem. When you've got complex integrated systems, you need centralized control, which kind of lends itself to the state. Whereas when you've got discrete operation, when I say discrete, I don't mean secretive, I mean separate. When you've got discrete operation, then it's much more suitable to a free market. And on to regulation. Remember I discussed electricity generators, power generators, who should really be a great opportunity for a private sector market full of innovation. But actually, the British energy market, the price is fixed as the price of the most expensive form of fuel being used. So in fact, now it's usually the price of gas. And this is because the government has set this, and they did this to encourage the renewable energy market. It's now a bit redundant, but they're stuck with it. The thing is here that you've got a government which is taking a strategic interest in a particular market. And when the government does that, it stops it from really being a free market. And I shouldn't pretend that it is. Now, I'm not saying regulation is necessarily bad. It's not always something to be avoided. Let me give you a little example here. So think about if you were in the freewheeling private sector USA with its low regulation, etc., and you went to your bank and tried to transfer money to another bank to somebody else's account, you'll find you couldn't do it. Now, are some web services that let you do this now, like Vimo and things. But in reality, you can't do it because the US market is not very heavily regulated, whereas in Europe, where there's much more regulation, it was much easier to build common frameworks for banks to do interbank transfers. So here we see the benefits of regulation. In fact, regulation can create what I call micro eggs. Let me just explain this. So imagine you have a new restaurant open up in your town somewhere near you. It's a Klingon restaurant selling Klingon food. You just go, hey, I'll just go to that restaurant. I'll go and give it a try. I've never eaten Klingon before. But you don't want to go into that restaurant and have to do your own microbiology and check the kitchen and check all the bits of strange alien animals are all separated and there aren't strange alien bacteria in there. You know, take samples and put them in petri dishes and incubate them. No, you can't do this. You don't have the skills. You need a microbiologist. And so we have trading standards who do this for you. So because you know trading standards, go into restaurants and take samples and check the behaviors of the chef and so on, you can pretty well trust any new restaurant is not going to poison you. You don't have to kind of hang back and wait and see if anybody dies by word of mouth. The regulations, the specialists keep you safe. And this is what I call tactical regulation, okay, as opposed to strategic regulation. It just means that people can have confidence in the things that they're buying, and thereby the private sector market can actually move faster and turn over faster and try new things faster than they could if everybody was having to rely on word of mouth and the consequences of food poisoning disasters. Okay, so let's have a look at our egg again. Let's zoom in here and focus on the golden yolk, the capitalist part of it. Actually, injecting regulation around, say, restaurants actually helps the private sector restaurants function. The same is true of lots of things like your car. You get an MOT off a private sector garage, but it's state regulated. So you have confidence in the quality of the car, that it's safe to drive. And the same would be true with toys. You know the paint doesn't have arsenic in it, and electrical things, you know that they'll be earthed. Because somebody else is taking care of these things for you, letting you make choices about what matters to you. This way, you've got micro eggs supporting different parts of the private sector. So we get tactical regulation dealing mostly with safety and fairness. And that's suitable for the private sector. And strategic regulation is when you need kind of a long-term national view of things. And that's where the state comes in. It becomes more of a public sector thing. So, for instance, network rail is strategically regulated, but the train operators are tactically regulated, for instance. Next, we have to understand how the private sector works and how it expects its payback for it to work effectively for us. So first of all, you're going to consider the scale of the investment. Now, things like national infrastructure, electricity networks, rail networks, these are huge investments. Now, obviously, the things like the rail network kind of grew as a private sector thing initially, but it was really expanded by the state when it really grew. Things like fiber optics, on the other hand, are much lighter engineering. They're kind of more manageable for the private sector. So I'm just going to pull a kind of finger in the air estimate up here and say that if it's over 10 billion, you probably have to have state involvement. Under 10 billion, it's kind of feasible for the private sector to manage that. Then there's the question of the return time scale. Now, Some projects like the Channel Tunnel probably still haven't paid back their money. But things like oil rigs might take 12 years. But that's kind of pushing it out. I'd say typically the private sector wants to be involved in projects that pay back within about 10 years or less. And then there's the risk issue. It's great to get the private sector to pick up risk where there's a risk of it not turning up, the results not coming through. It's great to sort of pass that on to the private sector where they're really kind of focused on making money. But they will want to be paid for that risk if they succeed. But if they don't succeed, make sure you don't pay them. Let me give you an illustrative example here. The NASA space program in the USA. Okay, they landed guys on the moon. There was no profit on it. It cost a lot of money. But it did lead, for instance, to semiconductors. They were actually developed for use in the space program. And that led to personal computers, which led to the internet, which led to all these hardware companies and all these software companies and all these tech companies. These companies must have turned over hundreds of billions of dollars over the years. They paid back the space program many, many, many times over. So it was a great investment, but nobody could see it. Nobody could know how it would turn up. So this is the kind of investment where it's so big and it's so long term and so vague that the state has to be involved. On matters where R&D is involved in a big way, it's quite a difficult one. Remember, for instance, I mentioned that British Rail used to do great R&D when it was in the public sector, and that fell away when it was privatised. In fact, it's just difficult to manage science particularly, because by definition, nobody understands the thing you're researching. Otherwise, you wouldn't be researching it. So just as a rule of thumb, let me just suggest that the science side of things, the research, belongs in the public sector for the most part. And you're better to pass on the development side, the engineering, to the private sector. No firm rule of thumb here, of course, but just a rough guide. So let's do a quick summary of these aspects and whether they should be public or private. Start with the most important one probably is, does the consumer actually have a choice? If it's something that you need, it should probably lie in the public sector, but if it's something that you want, it may well work in the private sector. And again, even if they have a choice, do they actually want to participate in this choice? If there's high participation, yeah, you can do in the private sector. If it's low, like for instance retail banking, then no public sector or a lot of public sector involvement. The commercial scale, we're just nominally saying less than or greater than 10 billion or above 10 billion, you're probably going to need private sector involvement at some level. Time scale again, less than 10 years, greater than 10 years. The risk, it's always nice if you can pass risk into the private sector. You will have to pay them for it, but if it's a low risk activity, maybe it will work well in the public sector. Again, complexity, if in very integrated systems like networks, you're probably going to have some kind of strategic control. Again, with regulation, it's the same thing. It's if it can be discreetly managed in a tactical way, it works in the private sector. But if you need a strategic overview, you're going to pull in public sector involvement. And R&D, well, basically the research goes in the public sector and the development goes in the private sector. So that's a quick overview of how this is going to work. Let's have a look at a few examples. Let's see if we can work out what would belong in the grey area of the egg. Start with healthcare. Obviously, we need healthcare. And quite honestly, if somebody tells you you've got cancer, you need a doctor to tell you what chemotherapy to take. You don't have much to say yourself, really. Most people can't add much into their own healthcare. Dr. Google to one side. Now, the commercial timescales and scale, they would work in the private sector. That's feasible. But it's a low risk activity. It's always going to be there in the sense that people always need healthcare. So there's nothing the private sector can offer in terms of risk amelioration. Now, ideally, you'd have a comprehensive health service where you have preventative medicine, you have your acute medicine, you have community follow-up, You use scanning services, all these sorts of things. It's really a highly integrated system to make it work properly. Even just within one service, you might need a GP and a consultant and a physiotherapist. Very complicated set of skills, and it's difficult for an individual to bring all these together in a private sector market. So it's very much an integrated healthcare business. And again, the government must take a strategic overview of healthcare in the country. Any sensible government would want to. R&D, well, there's not a lot of money to be made in blue skies research in health, but certainly in development of drugs and things, there's a role for the private sector there. So I'd say overall, what you're looking at here is broadly public sector activity with some room for private sector involvement. Let's look at retail banking, as we mentioned earlier. Okay, it's really something you need. People have to have banking facilities. But as we discussed before, they have very little interest in running a market in this. They don't understand it well enough to make decisions or benefit from these decisions in most cases. The commercial scale can certainly be less than 10 billion for that sort of thing. You can get banks capitalized less than 10 billion, etc. The time scales are private sector that they'll work. It's in relative sense, it should be low risk. You shouldn't be risking people's money, so there's no real benefit to having it in the private sector from that point of view. It can be either integrated or discrete. Let's face it. I mean, the integration, like the interbank transfer services, requires integration, but then a lot of the services are entirely discrete. So it could be either of those. Regulation is largely tactical. I don't think the government takes a big interest in where the retail banking market is going. As long as it's there, they're quite happy. And there's no real research done this, so it's the development is done things like payment service development and stuff. So you look at this, what you're probably seeing is something that kind of really is a private sector activity, but probably needs quite a lot of state involvement. Maybe some fairly tight tactical regulation on it. By contrast, let's look at merchant banking. Now, most people aren't forced to be involved in merchant banking. Obviously, if you're running a large business, you'll be involved in it. But you would then expect that you have a large amount of knowledge of that. You can get advisors, you can pay advisors, you can get the information you need, you can compare the products on offer in the market. So it's it's an optional and high involvement activity. So it's fit for a private market that way. The commercial scale could be either above or below 10 billion. So you might want a bit of public sector help in really big projects. Same with long projects. Naturally, it's high risk thing, trading, etc. They try to lower the risks, but it's not why you want the state to be involved, risking large amounts of money. And it can be either discrete or integrated. Again, big projects might need government help, regulation, etc. to make them work. I don't think the government has a strategic view of where merchant banking is going. It just lets it go, so it's tactically regulated, basically provides laws around it. And again, there's no research side to this, it's all development. So I'd say the pointer here is that, except for very big projects, the merchant banking really is a private sector activity. So let's look at what we've got. We've got a kind of scale here from the private sector to the public sector and a variety of different industries working in them. So at one end, you've got the kind of the public end where the state is the principal employer, which will be the military, police, or the NHS. Now, they might buy a lot of stuff off the private sector, but essentially most of the personnel work directly for the state. On the other end, you've got the private sector, which has tactical regulation, i.e. sort of safety regulation in most cases, which could be the power generators, but right now kind of isn't. But train operators, MOT garages actually kind of work as private industry, but for the government. Then there's restaurants and merchant banks, etc. Tactical regulation makes these safer for us all to use. But what about those industries where it was kind of a grey area, it was kind of mixed? There's a couple of options here. First of all, you could use kind of the Scottish Water approach. You've got a kind of public corporation, a central authority with the budget, and it just buys in services off the private sector to greater or lesser degree. Alternatively, what you could have is a purely private sector company, but with strategic regulation, where basically the government is all over that company with boots saying what it really has to do, but it leaves the company to get on and do it. Okay, so these are kind of the options we have when we're mixing these things up. Quick word of warning on mixing public and private activities. As Adam Smith said, you must never give a commercial enterprise the powers of the state, that is, the powers to arrest, the power to control, the power to prosecute. Look at what happened in the post office. It was a private sector company that could start prosecutions in its own right. And this would apply to things like psychiatric hospitals and prisons. The powers of arrest and detention must always stay with the state that has no commercial interest involved. But back to my main theme. Let's have a look at what we have now. So we've got our egg here. If I kind of take a more higher level overview, we've got three sections. We've got the outer socialist section. We've got which gives structure. We've got the yellow capitalist yolk, which gives progress. And we've got the grey area that mixes the two. And they're all bound together by this chains of democracy. So without socialism, there is no structure within which capitalism can exist. Without capitalism, there is no progress. Just compare the Western world to the Third World or the communist world. I mean, these other parts of the planet, they really depend upon the Western world to do all the development for them. Certain authoritarian states spend their entire time stealing technology off the West. And there is a grey area, a boundary between them, and we need to have an understanding of how this works, which I hope I've demonstrated to some extent. This is a symbiosis. It's not a competition. They're not in opposition to each other. Capitalism is the child prodigy of socialism. So how is our symbiotic egg doing these days? Let's have a wee review of the country. We've had 30 years of falling productivity growth. 20% of working people actually claim in-work benefits. We've got critical housing shortages and lack of jobs for youngsters. It's not looking good. The only thing that seems to grow is the financial sector, particularly mortgage lending. Meanwhile, you've got the left-wing fantasy war against capitalism, and the right wing has been trying to promote capitalism without really understanding what it's doing. So what happens if capitalism fails? If it stops investing in new constructions, new inventions, and new services? Instead of just investing in buying houses that the state keeps in short supply through planning laws? Or it just goes and buys shares in privatized utilities, which are effectively private sector tax systems? You stop investing in capital and progress stops. And unfortunately, it has stopped. If we take another look back at our egg and we zoom in to our golden yolk, what's happened is it's been infected, it's been corrupted, mostly by something called financialization, where instead of investing in the real economy, financiers just look to things they can charge rent on, like housing or in just about anything else. And socialism needs to stop fighting against capitalism, and it needs to start protecting it from this corruption that's rotting it from within. Unfortunately, we've elected ourselves or chosen to be led by a ship of fools. And all the crew that we've put in it over the years, and none of them have any clue what they're doing. They're all following dinner party level theories of economics. And I'm afraid that all we've got to look forward to is this. Sorry to be so depressing. The end. Thank you for listening.